9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm David Rothkopf, your host, and we are here to talk about one of the items that has been biggest in the news this week, and that is Mark Zuckerberg's decision to change the way his companies, the Meta group of companies, handle dealing with facts and opinions, moving away from fact-checking and towards community notes. We are joined by our friend who is exactly the person I wanted to talk to about this, Renee DiResta. She's an associate research professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown, and she previously worked as the technical research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. How are you, Renee?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. This development this week, I guess, should have been more surprising, but it's coming in the context of a whole bunch of things that I think represent a broader trend. But let's take it in pieces. What was your reaction to the Meta announcement, and perhaps if you saw the Zuckerberg video that went with it, in which he was wearing a $900,000 watch, I'm told? Maybe you want to talk about that. I've never seen a $900,000 watch. I thought that was quite interesting, but that may not be the main point that you focused on.
I am not, I know nothing about watches and saw the watch, but really was, my eyes were drawn to the gold chain. So the necklace is more obtrusive, maybe cost less. No, I think, would it help for me to just kind of summarize the points that were in the announcement? Because there was a lot that got put into that. Okay.
Yes, please.
So a few things happened. First, and the thing that the media has focused on most of all, is that Meta ended, or Zuck announced the end of the third-party fact-checking program. So this was the program that was put in place in 2016 after the kind of recurring spread of what we quaintly called fake news back then. And these were stories that were actually fake. Things like Pope endorses Donald Trump or Megyn Kelly fired from Fox News were two that I remembered seeing in my own feed back in the day. And these were the sort of things where, after the election, as people began to look at what had gone viral on Facebook, Meta began to implement this fact-checking program to try to append additional context to information that was up on its platform. And I just want to emphasize that, because the point of this was so that they didn't take crazy stories down. They left them up, but they put up a fact check. So that was what the program was designed to do. So this program became kind of significantly hated by a large part of the right, particularly because Twitter also had a similar program, and it occasionally put labels and fact checks on the speech of conservative political figures, most notably Donald Trump. And so this was sort of reframed as censorship as part of this broader movement to reframe content moderation as censorship. And even though it was adding labels, Meta decided in this speech to kill it, which a lot of people are reading as essentially a capitulation to the political winds changing. And I think that that's quite true. But there's other things that were announced too. So there was, in lieu of fact checking, we're now going to have community notes. So this was a model that Twitter pioneered in the days even prior to Elon. It used to be called Birdwatch, where anybody, any normie, can go and see a post on social media and throw up a note and say, write a note, I should say, and say like, hey, this post is wrong and here's why. And then if a sufficient number of people from across what the platform intuits to be political identities agree that the note is good, then the note shows up on the content. So just because somebody writes a community note doesn't mean that the community note ever actually makes it to the content. And that's a really important thing to understand. So we're moving to this model where people are going to be able to add notes, but it's not clear that all those notes are going to show up. There's a lot that's great about community notes, but there's a lot that's mediocre, and we can go into that if you're interested later. But there were also some little announcements that were made that were like, kind of read as gifts. There was this sort of funny comment about how we're going to, the company's going to move the fact checkers and the moderators, the trust and safety teams to Texas from California to avoid the appearance of political bias. which a lot of people in the industry found very funny because a lot of those teams have been in Texas for a long time. So to see this reframed as like, some act of political benevolence to stop the California wokes from doing too much was kind of a funny way to frame it. Finally, the last thing was he made these comments about adjusting policy enforcement of user-created comments. So a lot of us have had experiences with the Facebook auto mods, misreading a comment and taking it down, or just, they're kind of in all the private groups also. So Zuck said that they're going to be significantly rolling that back and now relying on people reporting content that they see. So a huge number of these changes really put the onus on the users. And then the final thing, which was actually a really big deal that unfortunately got neglected, was that they changed some of the language in the hate speech policy, the sort of hateful content policy. This is not an area I personally work in, but you can read the change logs, you can see the shift, and they now have, permission in there to you're not supposed to accuse people of being mentally ill, but now you can do that if they're gay or trans. You're not supposed to use certain language to describe and dehumanize people, but you can call women property now. So there's these very perplexing additions that Zuck framed as being more in line with the culture and the discourse, which I think are quite transparently political. And that's why the majority of this announcement in aggregate was read kind of as a gift to Trump. And I will stop monologuing now, but I hope that summarizes what's happened.
Well, it wasn't a monologue, and it was exactly what we wanted to talk about. There were a lot of people who said, well, Zuckerberg went to Mar-a-Lago and he undoubtedly got some kind of feedback from Trump, and he's stepping up to do these things directly in response to Trump. But then there were other people who said, well, he was pretty Trumpy to begin with, and they're not that surprised by these moves. How did you feel about that?
I think there's been political character arcs over time for large parts of the Valley, including the heads of the companies. I think there's always been we call it techno-libertarianism, just a sort of inclination to freedom that I think is a good inclination. But one thing that happens with platform policy is that the policies really reflect the values of the platform. And Zuck is a unique case in now Elon too, but in how much of the platform he controls, right? And so the changes, it's not clear whether it indicates a value shift internally or because Donald Trump has spent a significant amount of time attacking Mark Zuckerberg over the last year, whether we can read this almost as a speech with an audience of one, right? Or maybe two or three, maybe Brendan Carr and Jim Jordan and a handful of regulators in there who now have the power to regulate. And so you see Zuck looking out for his interest, which is, of course, the company's interest is his interest, and making these changes to not fall afoul of the president who was threatening to jail him a few short weeks ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, it also came in a broader context, which we should point out, which was the head of the government relations for Meta, a guy named Nick Clegg, who was a British politician, but would be seen by Americans as more on the liberal part of the spectrum than typical Republicans, is left, and he's being replaced by a Republican operative. They've added to the board a wrestling promoter who is a friend of or martial arts promoter who's a friend of Donald Trump's. Doesn't have any appreciable experience in this area, but is clearly a sop to Donald Trump. And also Zuckerberg said he would contribute, as multiple folks from the Valley are doing, $1 million to Trump's already overfunded inaugural, which I think has $170 million on hand. So I'm wondering if you wanted to address any of those things.
The board shifts again, I think, are reflective of the I believe Dana White is the gentleman's name, and he's also a big supporter and friend of Donald Trump as well. Zuck's also been much more interested in mixed martial arts. He posts himself fighting and things, so not entirely an unexpected shift. Again, these platforms will, the pendulum swings pretty far sometimes. Seems like we never hit the nice normal middle. We go from one side to the other, and what we're seeing here, I think, is very much that shift back to these are the people that I need to be in the good graces of to ensure that I can operate in the way that I want to and maximize my business, minimize oversight or regulation. And I think that basic explanation really covers a lot of it.
Yeah, this is seen, as an act of Mark Zuckerberg or an act of Meta. But of course, it comes in a context. And the context is a broader set of changes that have happened in kind of the information environment that have altered it in, I think, fairly dramatic ways for people. Yes. You have Elon Musk taking over Twitter, changing the name to X, changing its policies, turning it into more of a home for the alt-right, where he actually amplifies the alt-right, and tried, I think, overtly to diminish the voice of the center-left in it. You've had billionaires with ties to Musk and the Valley take over the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times and say, well, we're not going to do pro-Kamala Harris editorials. They've had an exodus of reporters from those places. Of course, Fox News was always in this place. The right-wing information sphere was always in this place. But you can look at American information and say it's getting increasingly hard for voters to get information that is not coming through either a right-wing filter or through a filter that is, to use the term of art that's most popular at the moment, kind of obeying in advance, where, for example, CNN and to a lesser extent the New York Times have shown a kind of an inclination to both sides things, even when that's sort of contrary to the underlying facts. And so I'm wondering what you think of this broader trend.
So there's so much in there. The first thing, the phrase that was in my head, one that I use a lot, is this is the problem of unaccountable private power, right? There's an incredible amount of control of the modern communication ecosystem that a handful of billionaires have. And this has been true for a very long time. And this is why for a brief period in time, around 2017 or so, you saw a lot of transparency from those companies. Again, because so much of what they do is in response to use another phrase, working the referees, right? The referees are in this case, the politicians or civil society groups or political factions that try to persuade the platforms to act in their interest, to maximize their interests. By reframing content moderation as censorship, by delegitimizing the very premise of moderating anything at all, by implying that putting a label on content or doing a fact check is censorship. I mean, it's more speech. It is the opposite of censorship. But we've simply reframed that because the people who were working the referees wanted the platforms to take that action. Now they have achieved that. And there's very little in the United States that there are very, very few controls over unaccountable private power on social media. One option now, though, for the users is to exit, right? To go to other platforms. There used to be only 2 or 3. In 2015, there were only 2 or 3 platforms. You saw that first exodus of users migrating to platforms more in line with their values, actually, from the right, which decided that it didn't want to be in it was convinced that the censorship was egregious. And so you saw the rise of Truth Social, of Parler, of Getter, this 4 or 5 different right-wing apps that mimicked Twitter, and then Rumble that mimicked YouTube, right? So you saw the creation of this alternate ecosystem where right-wing users could go. You've seen that on the left now too, particularly after the Elon takeover and after people began to get very frustrated with what you're describing, which is the platform owner controls the curation algorithm. You, the user, don't really have the ability to do that unless you spend an inordinate amount of time blocking and muting and trying to fight against the flow of what the platform has decided you should see, which is informed by the values of corporate in this case. And so that led to a migration on the left to Blue Sky and Threads. And Zuck actually refers to this in his litany of things. There were 2 other points I didn't even mention because this was like the most dense policy sea change ever. he says, we're going to start showing more political content. This is, in a sense, a response to people on the left saying we aren't seeing political content on Threads. They were saying that in the lead up to the Kamala Harris, as Kamala Harris was running, because they wanted to be able to have political conversations, and it was a lefty space, and they were very frustrated that Threads had made a decision to minimize political content. So Zuck says, okay, we're going to change that. The other piece of this, though, is that as much as I will freely admit, I was happy with the self-regulatory actions, because I do feel like government does not like, I don't think it's the business of the American government to insert itself into content moderation. But I think that unaccountable private power is also bad. So you have two bad options, right? Do you let the platform control it? Do you want the government to control it? No. So I've been a big advocate for giving users that much more granular control. But the other option that we've seen is regulation, and that has come primarily from Europe. And so the Digital Services Act in Europe, way too long to go into all the nitty-gritty details, but it does have gives the European authorities the right to request that Meta act on certain content. And so that showed up in Zuck's speech as well, as he said that he wanted to partner with the Trump administration to fight back against governments that were demanding more censorship. And the name checks that you see are references to this, to European kind of regulation. He talks about Latin American secret courts. That's a reference to Brazil. Elon and the Brazilian government, this Judge Moraes, had a fight. They played chicken for a while. Brazil won, where Brazil's saying, like, under Brazilian sovereignty, you have to action these accounts. And that was a huge topic of debate for a while. So this is, again, a monologue, but what you're seeing is the problem of not having either a sense of legitimacy in who should control curation and moderation and all of the rules here, that the government is not great and the platforms themselves are also not great. And that terrible trap of being caught. And then also at a much more meta level, conflicting the conflicting values of how Latin America, Europe, the United States, India, Singapore, a whole bunch of countries have come in with regulatory rules around speech, and the platforms don't like that either, because then they're sort of forced to be in a compliance regime in order to continue operating in those areas.
Well, I blame the Democrats. I'm kind of half kidding, but I was in the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration started a lot of this with the Telecommunications Act of whatever that was, 1996 or 7, in which this decision was made to treat these folks as though they were not media companies.
Right.
And for most of American history, if you're a media company, it was understood that a responsibility came along with that. There were a variety of regulations that went with it. Broadcast organizations were treated in a certain kind of a way. But so were advertisers and others. There was this notion that you sort of had to tell the truth and not promote things that were contrary to the public interest. And the Europeans have sort of built on that tradition. And I guess it's also worth noting here that Zuckerberg, for his complaints about the European system, also announced that Europe would still have fact checkers because it's kind of the law there, right?
Correct. Yes. And that's a this is, again, I've seen some sort of funny articles go by about how, like, oh, we can't get into his head. We don't know how political this was. And I'm like, okay, come on. We know. Let's just say it. So we're going to see this interesting natural experiment, I suppose, where those programs will continue in parts of the world and they will not continue here in the U.S. And we'll get to see, what a community noticing, process actually looks like. I've got to say, I was a little bit surprised. Normally when Meta makes a massive sort of feature sea change like this, and they tried some community involvement back in 2019 and it didn't succeed and they kind of killed that program. But this is a major, major, major shift it's going to require, like, infrastructure. Like, you're going to have a mechanism by which you can sign up for notes, by which they validate the accounts to make sure that they're not getting brigaded by fake accounts or by, ideological, like, brigading groups that used to try to manipulate trends, right? Whenever you change the rules, there's a huge amount of manipulation where people try to test the rules. So that's going to happen. And then the other piece that's interesting is, like, normally you see little indications, like leaks, if you will, where some number of people get into like an early test, or you see the feature come out, or they start to talk about it and socialize it in media appearances and things. And this was just very much like okay, we're doing this. And some of the articles that have come out suggest that I think the journalism partners in that fact-checking program got like 5 hours notice or something. So this feels like a very political shift. And now we're going to see how European regulations lead to different experiences.
Yeah. Well, in fact, you and I may have talked about this in one of our prior conversations, but there are kind of three big philosophical views on this in the world right now. There's a US view, which is more corporate centric. There's a European view, which is a kind of seeks to have more of a balance and a government regulatory role, but nonetheless, promote markets and capitalist ideas underneath that. And then there's a Chinese and authoritarian model, which is the government controls it all, and you've just got to follow along with the rules. And I don't think we're getting any closer to the resolution of that. I guess one question is, can we expect this to ebb and flow depending on who's in charge in the United States?
That's what I'm afraid of, right? That you're going to just see these big pendulum swings back and forth. That rather than, I always, think in my head, like, can't we just be normal? Can't we just have like a nice evidence-based assessment? Like if Meta had come out and said, you know what, it's January 2025, and we're finding that our fact-checking program is just not working very effectively, by which we mean the following impacts are not being had, right? And like lay it out there and say, so we're going to try this pilot because we're intrigued by the impact it seems to be having on X, and we want to bring this in. And that, I think that would have been like a perfectly reasonable, okay, well, we're going to try this new experiment now as a feature. What a fantastic experiment. Let's do it. It's the way that it's framed, right? It's that in that conversation, he says, the fact checkers were biased. And that's a huge claim just laid out there. And it kind of flies in the face of, recent, I know nobody trusts academics either, but recent academic papers that have gone and looked at what did the fact checkers fact check. There's a really interesting paper, Jake Shapiro out of Princeton's one of the authors, it's open access, anyone can Google it, in which they find that the majority of the time, PolitiFact is fact-checking like famous politicians, like Bernie Sanders is getting fact-checked an awful lot. And then it seems to be that it's actually like who's famous and in the news. And that's the determinant, not them going after right-wing politicians more, which would be what you would expect to see if there was bias. And the Dispatch, which is a conservative publication, also came out and said, hey, we've participated in this program. Yes, there were occasional instances in which a partner wrote a fact check that we wouldn't have written, or that we wouldn't have taken that tone. There's some disagreement there. But overall, we as, conservative participants actually found it to be quite a good program. So instead of this nice, normal, we're trying to create the best social media platform for everybody, because these platforms are tools of power, because politicians want that power, and because they're trying to maximize their advantage, we get the pendulum swings that come from the ref working.
Yeah, although, I think that's an accurate representation. I've seen some of the studies that showed that fact-checking actually wasn't really a big problem. It was actually working pretty well and without a lot of complaints. But even having this discussion in the way that we have this discussion is kind of a concession to the people on the right that have brought it up and suggested that somehow facts are debatable. And, that is, a interesting metaphysical, well, it's actually not that interesting. Facts aren't debatable. Facts are facts. But there are facts that are important to the public interest. This all goes back to COVID, which much in our lives does, and I think we don't fully appreciate it. But this goes back to COVID when science said one thing, and a bunch of people for political reasons said something else. And scientists said, but no, science. And those people said, but that's your opinion. And, it A, wasn't their opinion, it was science. And B, there was a consequence of promoting the lie, which was people would die. And, the government typically throughout history has said, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You can't do things that cause damage. And it's enshrined in every, sort of legal system to which we pay any respect. That idea of serving the public good ought to be guiding this. And I'm leaving the issues of opinion aside.
Yeah.
I'm just saying there is this core thing that we shouldn't actually be debating. And yet we seem to be entering a period. I mean, God help us if there's a pandemic.
This, I think, is when I said that platform policies reflect platform values, right? And that was in the context of the hate speech policy. But again, policies reflect values in this. The early, you can go back and you can read them. They're all readily available. You can read Meta's early statements when it launches this program, and it really emphasizes we take our responsibility seriously. They are effectively the editorial curator of information, to kind of nod to your comment about treating them as media or not. So they're carriers, meaning they are hosting the contributed speech of their users. And that's what we want, right? We want that to be maximized, and there are a variety of reasons why the regulations were written as they were to support that. I'll just nod to Jeff Koseff's book, which has fire in the name, and he hates the crowded theater thing. But anyway, well, holding that aside, but there is this the framing of it as a First Amendment issue is recent, right? Because what the platform is doing with its policies is it's determining what it's going to curate, what it's going to amplify, what it's going to show you, right? There's no neutral. They are taking a stance when they decide what is going to be moderated away, whether that's through taking it down or doing something more like contextualization and labeling. They're making a decision there. They're deciding what you are going to see. And then similarly, when they're algorithmically curating something like the posts in your feed, again, there's no neutral. So as long as users have no control and no agency over that process, I do think that there is a responsibility that the platforms have, and they will periodically acknowledge this responsibility, usually when there's a crisis and they're being held to account, right? Where they're kind of scrambling, there was a genocide in Myanmar. Maybe we should look at what happened there, right? And I'm not trying to sound glib. It's really just it's astonishing to me that we relitigate these things and that we kind of forget the through line of why we got to the policies that we did. COVID was a huge shift because institutional authorities did get things wrong. And what should have happened in that case is when the science changed, right? When we learned something new about COVID, is it airborne? Do masks work? Where did it come from? All these things. That's an opportunity for kind of a new, like a fact check of the fact check, if you will. Again, if we were treating this not as a matter of identity and partisanship, but treating it as a matter of how do we make sense of the world collectively in our best interest ahead of potentially a new pandemic, what you want to see there is this ability to say the world has changed, the information has changed, and now this is what we're surfacing instead. But now we are constantly litigating who made the mistake and when, and who was, what platform suppressed what truth and when, and we're very much stuck in this spiral where it's not clear to me how we get out of it and reset on coming together on the shared value that maybe viral stories, that are completely fake are just not helpful to us as a society. There's wildfires in California now, and it's very evocative of what happened when there was mudslides and a hurricane in North Carolina, where you open up your app and what you're going to see is the most sensational hot take about what government official or agency failed, as opposed to good information about what is happening and what the public can and should do. And I think that that's very, very destructive for us.
Yeah. I mean, and, that issue, cuts to one of these core questions. If 99.9% of hundreds of thousands of scientists around the world agree that man-made climate change is something, that theoretically ought to be treated differently from the opinions of people who don't know anything, who disagree. And yet it's not. And, there is this argument that it shouldn't be the case. But in our remaining time, and you certainly feel free to comment on that. There's one other element of this I'd like to raise up, because as all this is happening, we also have another phenomenon, which is the proprietor of one of these big websites, Elon Musk, has been tweeting like crazy. And he will often say, hey, yeah, that's right. Somebody will say something that's Nazi or white supremacist or completely wrong. And he'll say, hey, yeah, that's right. And he is amplifying within the algorithm his voice so that it reaches a lot of people, maybe reaches a lot of people first. And so this doesn't become, the free flow of multiple opinions, but it actually becomes guided in a certain way. And and again, we have limited time, but go on as long as you want. There's another element of this, which I find kind of curious. I don't find it curious. I find it, provocative. That Elon Musk is the senior most advisor to the incoming president of the United States. So that's typically in those situations when somebody says something, it's presumed to come with the authority of high office in the U.S. And so that colors it as well. And I was just wondering what your reaction is to that phenomenon.
That again is the kind of uneven visibility of social media. And so what you should hope to see is a community note show up very quickly, or a fact check, right? Back in the olden days, like when Donald Trump was, tweeting conspiracy theories about voter fraud during the 2020 election, Twitter's teams did, in fact, throw contextualization labels on some of his tweets. And they tried to do it fairly quickly so that as the tweet was spreading, people would see the context. It doesn't do you very much good if the loudest voice is on the platform. And remember, pre-Elon, Trump was the loudest voice on that platform. So when you would see the sort of truth, the lie go halfway around the proverbial world before the truth actually got its pants on and got appended to the tweet, you have that problem of people, kind of seeing things and forming opinions, and that it's like a structural problem. Right? I was having an interesting conversation with somebody who was like, well, what I like about media is that they have to do the fact check before it hits the page. Right. And then they have to issue a correction. Otherwise, again, there's like a likelihood that they're going to get sued or something. And that doesn't happen on platforms because it's supposed to be all of us talking. But some of us are much louder than others. And that question of how you handle that structural problem is supposed to be through labels that get put on, or alternately counter speech, right? And you're supposed to, the argument, the theory has always been that in the marketplace of ideas, Elon says something wrong and then somebody else comes in and corrects. But there too, like it's just one of the kind of areas that I'm working on this year is that question of like, can you make institutions like who might have more information, can you surface their content a little bit better in some way? When we have an emergency going on, like right now, we can use the wildfires. You don't want the comms teams or the teams that are supposed to be out there tweeting information about the fires or where people should go or, who needs to evacuate when. You don't want them getting in a tit for tat with random people who are wrong on the platform. They have a job to do. And so one question is, whose job is it then to do that fighting? Because somebody actually does have to be doing it. And that's where I think a lot of people have just kind of gotten fed up and exited the platform also. So there's not a real, there's no really good answer, except maybe to say like, the shift that we need to make is to assume that this is much more of an entertainment platform than an information or news platform, and to sort of have the mental shift, which is to say, sadly, this is no longer the place to go when I want to be the most informed I can possibly be about an emerging crisis.
Yeah, although there are some news platforms that are completely biased and call themselves news platforms, because we've gotten into that. But the point you make is one that we've seen now a couple times recently, because during the hurricanes that hit the southeast during the campaign, Trump was saying, "Well, FEMA's not doing this, or they don't have that," and that was political, and it was also wrong, and it was having the effect of saying to people who are in the middle of the crisis things that might actually hurt them.
Right.
And in the case of the California crisis, saying, the government's mishandling this and it's all Gavin Newsom's fault. And, the water problem is because of X or Y. It does have the effect of potentially undermining the credibility of the people you need to listen to, and creating, unconstructive debates or trends. So just sort of throwing up our hands and saying, "Oh, this is entertainment. You can't trust these places." It's a problem. And one of the things it suggests is to say, how do I know what to trust? Should certain places carry a little blue seal in the upper left-hand corner and says, this is a media outlet and it plays by these rules?
This is, people have tried that actually. There are these like credibility indicators, like NewsGuard has some, there's a media bias fact check, there's a few of them. Most of the time, again, it's around biases and fact checks. I do think this is an interesting model for journalism, which is how do you have that triaged, curated feed of accurate information somewhere? And is there, are there either accounts that we begin to trust for this? Like, what is the mechanism by which this happens? People who are, maybe they have somebody on the ground. A lot of what you're describing, like Gavin Newsom did this and so on and so forth, that's commentary. Let people people are going to have their commentary. They're going to say what they want. They're going to fight about it. They're going to turn everything partisan. You should find a way to unfortunately, the commentary is what captures the attention because the algorithm is rewarding that rage and that sensationalism. And now people are directly monetizing it, right? They want to be the first with a hot take that's going to get tons of engagement because that's how you make money as a content creator on Twitter. So we've incentivized a lot of the wrong things, which is why I think this, for me, the shift to saying okay, this is an entertainment platform now. This is it's like watching the commentary news programs as opposed to watching the channel that is the weatherman out there reporting on what is happening on the ground, right? Or the journalist in the conflict zone communicating the accurate information. There is that divide. I don't want to explain this to you, right? You know this way better than me, but just that resourcing of journalism, of fact finding.
But I think there is a responsibility here, and I think you're onto something which is really important. A responsibility that the state is shrugging off.
Yeah.
That needs to be picked up by responsible media organizations who need to embrace codes and standards in a public way and to do a little, this dates me a little bit perhaps because I don't know if anybody remembers this kind of thing, but there was the good housekeeping seal of approval, or you go into a building and it says this is an LEED building because it's built to certain kinds of standards. And it just says to you, oh, okay, this is a little bit more environmentally conscious organization or something like that. And I don't think it would be crazy for media outlet X, platform Y, to carry on its about page and put on at the beginning of the day, the end of the day, in the middle of the day, a little statement that says, we adhere to the following principles that are accepted among journalism organizations. Facts are fact checked in the following kind of way. We seek to be objective in our presentation of the facts. We are a news organization. We are not an entertainment organization, something like that, so that somebody can then say, oh, I want to subscribe to one of those because that's more helpful to me as a voter or as a citizen or as just living my life. That doesn't seem irrational to me because I think it could be done, in a month by a bunch of organizations if they put their minds to it.
Yeah. No, I think that question of credibility is also becoming partisan at this point. It's an interesting phenomenon. I think I was thinking about this the other day, people see fact checks as evidence that somebody got something wrong, right? Which they see as a detriment, like something that is bad that has happened. But actually that act of publishing the fact check is the institution holding itself accountable, right? It is, in fact, an indicator of credibility. We're human. We made this mistake. Here's how we're correcting it. I think we need to change the thinking on what that means. There's a couple of outlets look, I've requested fact checks about wild things people have written about me. And I can't get them because the outlet doesn't want to do them, right? And it's an incredible experience to go through. You feel like they don't want to have to publish the fact check because they think that that undermines their credibility. And I think that it's actually the exact opposite, right? It shows that they're a reputable organization that is holding itself to account, and we need to be shifting the thinking in that direction. And that's the sort of thing where I would actually really like to see. I've started actually searching domains of, some independent media organizations just to see how often the word correction appears, just to get a sense of, are they actually doing it, or is it just once it's on the page, it's canon, and they've moved on to the next thing.
Yeah, although we could go on and on about this, and fortunately for me and for our listeners, we have been going on for several conversations, and I hope it continues. But there is a countervailing trend with that, because as you're saying it, I'm thinking, well, the other day Mika Brzezinski got on the air on Morning Joe, and somebody said that Trump had been found guilty, or Trump had committed rape, and she popped on the air and she said, well, according to the judge, he was found guilty by the jury of sexual assault. And of course, the judge then also wrote, commonly known as rape. But that was a correction that was kind of a bending of the knee to the Trump side, right? And so sometimes the corrections are colored too.
I guess, you wind up in the everything is a mess, and we wind up in nihilism. So it's I think the challenge for us all is there a way to get past the polarization where you feel like we're so entrenched in vitriol, you feel almost like a team affinity for one outlet versus another, and it prevents you from seeing the information environment more holistically, or thinking about things in terms of values. I don't think it should be particularly controversial to say, the platform choosing to curate higher quality information is a net benefit to society. You do have to discuss, what does that mean? You have to put some transparency signals out there. That may be the model that works on centralized platforms. I think that decentralized platforms where users have that more granular control is another option for people who don't want the platforms to control it, don't trust anything. They want full ability to set their own feeds. You can go do that over on Blue Sky now, right? So there's a lot of different models and a lot of different options, but ultimately, the information problem is much more a reflection of a crisis of trust and a crisis of our ability to reach social consensus. And so I think work on those latter 2 points is critical, even as we, kind of move the levers in the information environment to try to see, this pendulum swing that has just happened is going to be profoundly impactful, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely right. Very well said. And I think this notion that in the world in which we live and are going to continue in, one of the highest forms of value added you can seek or provide is trust. And the question becomes, how do you provide it? How do you guarantee it? How do you make it transparent? I mean, there's a whole subset of issues that you alluded to earlier with algorithmic transparency. And if I don't know what the algorithm is, I don't know what's getting promoted, what's getting minimized, who's getting promoted, and so forth. And if you're going to be trustworthy, then you need to play by some algorithmic rules as well as some fact-checking rules. Anyway, Renee, this has been great. You have been great as usual. This is just what I think we all needed. And I hope we can continue this conversation from wherever the next hotel room you end up in.
Awesome. Sounds great.
Sometime soon. But for now, thank you very much, Renee. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll keep on all of these things, both on our normal series of podcasts, also on our Scylla Consciousness podcast. And we hope you will join us for all of that here at the DSR Network. Until then, bye-bye.